So thank you again for joining us. I just want to start by asking you whether you're in favour of seeing a further step up of sanctions on Venezuela at this point.
Well, what I'm in favor of is in trying to convince the government of Venezuela not to move forward with this election of a constituent assembly on the 30th of July.
And how
we need to all figure out how to prevent that from happening. And the administration's looking at sanctions as the way to do that.
And do you believe that that will work?
Well, my concern is that if it's not done well, that it will, in fact, harden the position of Nicolas Maduro, the president of Venezuela. Once this election is held, it's going to be very difficult for them to undo it. It's like unringing a bell.
So you're saying that the next 10 days, effectively, for Venezuela are critical? Because if this vote takes place on July the 30th, then it will start a chain of events that even sanctions won't be willing to prevent?
That's my belief, is that once they go down this path, it's like a one-way street. They're not going to be able to go back. And so it's really key. Everybody's focused on the United States. I think we need to focus on the international community, particularly in Latin America and the Caribbean, but also in Europe.
What's the likelihood, though, of being able to coordinate as the international community to do something about President Maduro? I mean, he's been a problem now for a long time, and the way that he's been behaving, the authoritarianism rule that we're seeing in Venezuela, hasn't really stipulated action before now.
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, the Secretary General of the Organization of American States has been working like crazy. Who's not been working like crazy is the government of the United States, unfortunately. I would love to see the State Department at the top level take a much higher profile role in trying to organize this, working with friends and allies and other democratic countries who are concerned about what's happening in Venezuela.
Do you think a step up of oil sanctions would make a difference to President Maduro? How long can the country last if the United States is not receiving oil imports from Venezuela?
Well, let's look at it another way, is that it's private companies that import oil from Venezuela. It's like 790,000 barrels a day. 13 refineries in the U.S. process Venezuelan crude oil. Replacing that's going to be tough. I'm not sure the administration is willing to go that far. It's 8% of U.S. consumption. It'll obviously send prices up. There are other sanctions that could work. One would be proceeding to indict people who've committed crimes in Venezuela that are crimes in the U.S., targeted sanctions, pulling visas on people. One thing the U.S. could do, I assume that our law enforcement and intelligence community's got loads of information about Venezuelan government officials and their buddies who've got property in the U.S., bank accounts in the U.S., bank accounts around the world. Making that public, I think, would go a long way. The sanctions themselves, we all know that sanctions take a long time to have an impact, and the people who it seems to always hurt worse isn't the government, but the regular people of the country, and the people of Venezuela are suffering right now.
You just called on the United States government, this administration, to do more. Why do you think they haven't up until this point?
I can't answer that question. I mean, Secretary Tillerson didn't go to the General Assembly of the Organization of American States. If he had been there, I like to think that he could have gotten the 3 more votes necessary for the Organization of American States to condemn Venezuela. That would have a much greater impact than the U.S. acting unilaterally. One of the reasons, I think, is that that second level of leadership at State Department is, in the Western Hemisphere Bureau at least, is just missing. They haven't been appointed yet. We need people there working full-time, all the time on Venezuela.
So you think actually it's the fact that there's ongoing issues with staffing? Quite frankly, this administration hasn't hired enough people to be able to point the leadership in the right direction and say, this is where we need to be focusing on, and we need to do it immediately.
There's loads of expertise in State Department and at the Defense Department and at the National Security Council at the working level, but it needs the leadership and the connection between the political level, the Secretary of State and the President, and that working level that's got the actual expertise, and pulling it together with the guys at Energy Department or wherever it may be, the people who can do the economic analysis and figure out where it's going and how, in this case, how we could have gotten 3 more votes of little, relatively small Caribbean countries to condemn Venezuela. I was at a meeting yesterday where people were asking President Carter, former President Carter, to intervene. I don't know if that will have any impact. There's former presidents and prime ministers who are trying to meet with the government of Venezuela. We need more current presidents and prime ministers instead of former presidents and prime ministers to take an active role.
The opposition held this unofficial plebiscite as well, and they got more than 7.2 million people voting. What happens if this vote is held on July the 30th and actually the government has less support actually than that opposition-led plebiscite? Do you think that gives President Maduro here any pause for thought? Because surely it raises some credibility issues.
Well, he's had serious credibility issues for a long time now. Look, he can't. They never held an election they were supposed to hold in last year for governors and mayors all across the country. They used a fake system to discount a recall referendum and not hold it that should have been called for. There's presidential elections that are supposed to be held next year, and that's the whole purpose of the Constituent Assembly, I'm sure, is to avoid holding presidential elections next year.
Do you see?
They're going to rewrite the Constitution in a way that allows the President Maduro and his party to stay in power.
Do you see this vote on the 30th of July as the end of democracy in Venezuela?
I think democracy in Venezuela ended a couple of years ago, quite frankly. It's a tough question that political scientists can argue about at universities. But where you've got a government, a system that's got the trappings of democracy, but where there is no separation of powers, where the Supreme Court and the electoral authority are in the pocket of the executive, where the executive has simply ignored the National Assembly, which was elected by the people. What Venezuela needs is more democracy, not less. And Nicolas Maduro is taking the country down the path of less democracy.